Secondary School in Oakville. We are excited to welcome our second speaker in our Loyola Equity Speaker Series. This series was developed in response to information provided by Loyola staff and students regarding areas they would like to learn more about to strengthen our community and ensure we are truly inclusive. Our hope is that the series will encourage conversation, allyship, and action, and help us live up to our school motto to treat everyone with dignity, equity, and respect. I'd like to introduce Loyola student Morgan Manilow, who is going to be our facilitator today and is going to lead us in prayer.
Lord, teach me to be generous, teach me to serve you as you deserve, to give and not to count the cost, to fight and not to heed the wound, to toil and not to seek for rest, to labor and to ask for no reward. Save me for all your knowing, that I do as you will. Amen.
Each of us has a relationship to the natural environment, the land, water, earth, the habitat, and ecosystems. Land acknowledgements provide us with an opportunity to offer recognition, respect to the original inhabitants of the regions that we live in and work on. There are many things that we can do to go beyond simply reading a land acknowledgement script. To make it more meaningful, we need to consider that we are, in fact, acknowledging not only the ancestral lands, but also the historical and complex intersections of settler impacts on Indigenous histories, economies, ecologies, livelihood, well-being, and governance structures. A territorial acknowledgement is not an endpoint in the journey of reconciliation. Actions create conditions for true reconciliation and create a foundation for restoring, renewing, or developing a new relationship with Indigenous peoples. For hundreds of years, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Attawaddaron, the Potawatomi, the Wendat, and Lenape nations have sought to walk gently on this land. They assisted the first European travelers to this territory and shared their knowledge for survival in what was, at times, a harsh climate. Under consultations from elders, knowledge holders from the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, the Indigenous Education Advisory Committee, along with Halton Catholic District School Board, created this land acknowledgement.
Halton, as we know it today,
is rich in the history and modern traditions
of many First Nations and the Métis.
From the lands of the Anishinaabe
to the Attawaddaron,
the Haudenosaunee,
and the Métis.
These lands surrounding the Great Lake
are steeped in Indigenous history.
As we gather today
on these treaty lands,
our Catholic social teachings
call us in solidarity
with our Indigenous brothers and sisters
to honor and respect 4 directions:
lands, waters, plants, animals, and ancestors
that walked before us.
All these wonderful elements of creation exist,
gifted to us by our Creator God. We acknowledge and thank
the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation
for being stewards of this traditional territory.
Morgan, if you'd like to continue with the introductions, please.
We would like to welcome Gen-Ling Chang, Ken Liu, and Sandy Yip to the second installment of our Loyola Equity Speaker Series. Gen-Ling Chang is the former Associate Director of Toronto District School Board. Currently, she is the Deputy Executive Director of the Alpha Education, a charitable organization dedicated to the humanitarian education, social justice, and global peace. Children and youth are her inspiration throughout her career and her dedication to learning that connects schools and communities. Ken Liu is president of Asian Canadian Educators Network, ACE Net, and centrally assigned Principal International Education Toronto District School Board. Sandy Yip is a vice president of the AC Net and Education.
Okay. Please join us in welcoming Gen-Ling Chang, Ken Liu, and Sandy Yip. Thank you.
So good afternoon, students, fellow teachers, staff, Halton Catholic District School Board. Thank you so much on behalf of AceNet and Alpha Education for inviting us today on this session where we get to share a little bit about ourselves. Wishing we could be with you in face-to-face so we can see your beautiful faces and you can share more about yourselves as well as we learn about how we work together, how we live together, and in particular, how we address issues that concern all of us, and racism in Canada, equity and diversity. In particular, we're going to talk a little bit about anti-Asian racism and share some of our stories. My colleagues Ken and Gen-Ling will be sharing this platform with me and us, and look forward to the conversation and our presentation with you today. Can't see all of you, but if you feel you need to and like to, raise your hand to say, speak up. We love to hear your voice. There's also a chat box that you can also enter in some of your comments as you're thinking about what we're saying. And as well, feel free to use the emoticons to wave your hands and thank you. It's always good to know I'm not just talking to myself. So Gen-Ling, Ken, did you want to introduce yourselves or should we start right off the bat?
I think we should start. Why don't you start? On this section, we are going to share some of our lived experiences and stories, and Sandy will begin with his story. Go ahead, Sandy, as part of our introduction.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to start by acknowledging and thank you for the land and acknowledgement as well. I also smudge in the morning. I've had an opportunity to work with Indigenous folks in my work. Actually, in my day job, I work with the Ontario government, with the Ministry of Education. And just want to take the time to acknowledge the space and place and where I work and live in Toronto as a dish with one spoon territory. I want to acknowledge our ancestors, the people's territories and treaties in which we reside, and give thanks to the Indigenous folks who have welcomed us here since time immemorial. And I say that as an opening to talk about the importance of recognizing our ancestors, our histories, our lived experiences, and our histories. I think you folks are a little younger and you're building your history, you're building your identity, and you're going to come across and learn who you are as you get older as well. I think what I'm sharing with you is maybe a little bit of an elder kind of conversation about the journey that I've had. So I'm 4 generations Chinese Canadian. Great-grandfather Charlie came in 1911 to Montreal, and we settled in Chinatown. And when I think about my family back in Montreal, I have visions of Chinatown. It's a place that I grew to love very much. I never really knew what it meant to be growing up in Chinatown. because when we moved out of Chinatown, I lived in a community that was largely white. I was amongst a few Chinese in the community, and I don't really know why, but I think it was not a very pleasant time for me. In fact, I didn't really face a lot of overt discrimination and racism. I was quite skilled in sports, and I spoke English. I think that helped. But somehow I wasn't very proud to be Chinese. I don't know. Maybe it's because my father was a cook. Maybe because we owned a Chinese restaurant. Maybe because I was ashamed that my parents didn't speak English, that they weren't very educated. I always had to explain things to them. And sometimes we're not so nice to our parents. And only later on do you learn how to appreciate who they are as people in our lives. But I call that what we consider racism, like the internalized. That means that I didn't like myself. It's another term called self-loathing. Didn't want to be Chinese at all. I actually wanted to be white. And because I spoke English, because I played sports, that was no problem. I didn't need to be Chinese. In fact, I didn't even want to be affiliated to my community and culture. And that kind of followed me right into high school. I'm thinking of high school in my day and where you folks are at, and thinking about how diverse the communities that you live in and how diverse the communities that I was as well in my high school. Now, I kind of had a multiracial group of friends, but I had wanted nothing to do with the Chinese club. I had nothing to do with the newcomer population. I wanted to be as far away of them as I could. Now, I'm not very proud to say that, because I think that as you grow up as a young person, you know the people that you like and you know the people that you don't like. In fact, sometimes we can be mean towards one another. And I didn't really know why I didn't like the newcomer, the foreign students. And I say this respectfully to the foreign students and the ESL students in our schools, because I love them now. I think because I didn't like who I was, I sort of took it out on who I was looking at. And I didn't realize how much that affected me until when I started working and I couldn't find a job. And wouldn't you know it, I had to work in the Chinese community. The same community that I didn't really like, I suddenly had to work to help newcomer families, get this, integrate into Canada. And I started to learn that, hey, wait a minute, not everyone treats Asians like they do treat myself, right? Like I was learning that systems like education, like rental housing, like police were not really treating the community very well. I started to learn about the discrimination that the Chinese are facing being Chinese in Montreal, even though many of us maybe even came in since 1911. And I started to understand about discrimination, both in systems, in schools, the rental board, the court system, and how the government at the time didn't really treat even our community so well. At one point in time in Montreal's development, they took out 3 churches, my playground, store owners to build a huge government building. And I remember seeing that planted right in Chinatown. I'm going like, why? What is it about us before we were okay to be here? Now you're planting yourself right in Chinatown. And I started to learn more about myself in terms of how systems and governments sometimes step in, and for those they don't really care about, they can just rip out their land and plant it. And I learned later on, there's a similar story of the Chinatown here in Toronto, where the original Chinatown was expropriated to build City Hall. Now you think about the lives that it impacts and the people that are involved as well too. And I think then when I started to understand systemic discrimination, I started to read books about being Chinese. And it wasn't anything that I learned in school. It was learning of Chinese Canadian history. It wasn't Chinese history from China. It was about Canadian history that included Chinese. And I started to realize that my story around being discriminated against is not new. It goes back generation. It goes back at the turn of the century. And it's only through my own discovery of the learning, and I started talking to members of the community, the elders, that they started to talk about the racism discrimination that they faced at the time. And I was seeing it as a 20-year-old working in the Chinese community. W5 was when a report came out that said, they reported that the Chinese were taking over University of Toronto, and they showed a picture of Chinese students, when in fact it wasn't newcomer students, it was actually all Canadian, largely Canadian-born students. So it also meant that the media was also discriminating against it. So these little pieces of story started to unravel for me to say, hey, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. And I think it's by learning your story, understanding how systems work, that I became more aware of the discrimination that I faced, that my family faced, why we were put in Chinatown. And I say put in Chinatown because nobody accepted us. I didn't realize that Chinatowns and Little Italies are in many respects a racist construct, because when my great-grandfather came, he couldn't live anywhere but Chinatown. He couldn't get a job. And so you start to learn how history, you think it's so far away, actually repeats itself today. So here we are today sharing you some of the stories. We want to bring to life some of the racism that we see today and also link it to the past. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandy, for that very strong, deep, and profound story of yourself and your family history. I think it is incumbent of us to all recognize our own stories and to reflect on who we are, our identity, our culture, and our communities. So good afternoon. My name is Kian Liu, and I have the pleasure of sharing with you that I have a little bit of a different story to share with you compared to Sandy. So when I was 8 years old, my entire family of 11 members landed in Canada as refugees. So we came to Canada as part of what would be called the boat people exodus from Vietnam. So when I was born in Vietnam, we experience racism as well. So racism is in different parts of the world, in different aspects and different ways of treating individuals who are different. And even though I was born in Vietnam, I'm of Chinese background. So when I was born, we were not considered Vietnamese citizens. So when there was a war between China and Vietnam, all of the Chinese, ethnic Chinese in Vietnam were told that they were no longer wanted and they need to return to China. And specifically to what Sandy mentioned, we did not feel like we belonged in Vietnam when we were told by the government who kicked us out. So my family uprooted ourselves and returned to China. And when I say return, luckily for my family, we do have deep roots in China. So there was a connection with our relatives, our family members, etc., etc. But in China, we had a very challenging and difficult life. My parents, I remember seeing my parents in the fields, farming and growing pineapples in 35, 40 degrees Celsius temperatures. And it was dreadful for them to do that. Not that they were experienced farmers, so it made things even more difficult for them. So my parents took on themselves to seek out opportunities for us to find other ways of living and also trying to find new futures for their younger children, which included myself. So one thing led to another. My parents were able to find enough resources and money for us as a family to sail from southern China to Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, we were very fortunate to be received by the government in Hong Kong as part of the boat people exodus from Vietnam. So we were in Hong Kong and lived there for about a year in refugee camps. Even though it wasn't the best and the most ideal living conditions, we felt really well taken care of, and we felt very fortunate to be alive because there were many people who were lost at sea when they were traveling from Vietnam to other places of safety when they were kicked out of Vietnam. Finally, we were welcomed to Canada by the Canadian government and by Jewish Canadians who took it on themselves to sponsor our family and many other families. So growing up in Toronto, I had a really wonderful childhood because when I came to Canada, I had friends who were of Chinese background, Vietnamese background, Greek background, South Asian background, all sorts of cultures that I grew up with. I had classes with, and who are my friends who I'd play soccer with, and had a really wonderful childhood. One of the things that I remember as a young boy was when I was in grade 4, when the whole school had a theme of learning ancient Chinese culture, Chinese history. So even as a young boy, I realized, oh my gosh, this school, all my classmates and all my friends are learning about a culture that I feel an affinity to. So I felt really connected there. However, as I grew up and understand that there are opportunities that my friends, my community welcomed me as a young boy, but also there were other situations that I did not feel welcome. I remember growing up in about grade 6. I was picked on by another boy just specifically because no reason at all, because of my race. Somebody came up to me and punched me in the face, and at that time I responded. So it was out of nowhere. So there, even though my childhood was very pleasant, overall I felt really secure, very safe. There were incidences that to this day, I would relate to acts of hate or acts of racism because others treated me different because of my race and my ethnicity. So just want to summarize that for you. I identify myself as Chinese Canadian, and I align my own identity to the cultures of Chinese, Vietnamese, and Canadian culture. And I see myself as belonging to communities that are within my huge family of 11 members, but also belonging to a network of friends, colleagues in the education field, but also most importantly, belonging to a supportive network of friends and other educators who we work with together, like Gen-Ling and Sandy, who are with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Ken and Sandy. I will start with a very short story when I was a teacher of grade 7, 8 students with the Toronto District School Board way back. And in my class, I distinctly remember after the first term began, a young girl, her name is Ya Qian, arrived into my class. She just newly arrived from China. And so, as most teachers would do, or all teachers would do, I introduced her to the class, make sure she had some friends, match her up, and we proceeded as a class. Over time, I noticed that Ya Chen was very much alone. And one day, she's ESL, she's in grade 7, and two of her classmates, Terry and David, came to talk to me and said, students are teasing her, students are avoiding her, and we want you to know, Ms. Chang. And we think it is because one of the main things they are always laughing at her is because she has a smell. Now, this is a very personal, very hurtful thing to do by peers to another child that's just hitting puberty. So I decided to have a conversation with Ya Chen, and she told me that she lived in a rooming house. She and her parents rented one room because they're poor, and there were many other families, and the landlord turns off the electricity at 5 every evening. And she had to study with either a flashlight or candles, and in winter it's so cold she could not bathe because the water was icy. And they had also limited ways of washing their clothes. I informed my principal, and the principal had a social worker, and he intervened and reported the landlord to the board rental agency that Sandy talked about. And the social worker in the district school board also helped to find alternative accommodation for them and found them a small basement apartment. Why did I tell this story? Because Ya Chan's story is a story that I resonate with. Like Ken, I grew up in a family and I was very confident of my culture and identity because I had grandparents and parents that constantly tell me stories about my heritage. I did not have that. I went to an only English-speaking school where speaking Chinese was not allowed, with the best of intentions of the teachers, because they believe of language acquisition is the more you practice, the better you're going to be at. Fast track it, how would I introduce myself? I'm Gen-Ling Chang. My grandparents came from China. I'm a second Chinese diaspora born outside China. I arrived in Canada as an adult immigrant. I have traveled and lived and worked in Malaysia, in Singapore, studied in England, and studied in Canada. I came to Canada to study, but Canada gave me such a warm reception. I applied to be a permanent resident and was accepted within 1 year. So this is only part of how I see myself, a myriad of identity constructed from my own family, communities I live in, countries I live in, and why I want to share this story, that all our histories, our stories, our histories, and they are complex and not a social construction of people about who I am. So now we now turn to the history of Canada and let me take you back in a retrospection back to Canada when the first settlers, like myself, like Sandy, like Ken, like the Jewish people, the European people, and many people came to Canada, where we are all guests of the indigenous people of this land. So Ken, could I have the next slide? Ken, can you change the slide?
Yes, I did. Is the historical context?
Yeah, I don't see it on my screen. It's not showing.
Let me just. Can you see it now?
No.
I see it, Gen-Ling.
But not on my screen. Oh, yeah, now it's up. This is a very condensed version of the history of Canada told in one way. What it traces is I need to acknowledge that this history is extracted and put together in by the British Columbia Federation of Teachers. So in the side, you see why is it important to know our history, which is Canada history, especially this history for today, where it's titled Racism in Canada's History. While it's called Racism in Canada's History, I want to invite students to think about it's also a story, a history of resilience, a story of history of self-determination, a story of various peoples in Canada who benefited from the Indigenous people, the African Black diaspora in the struggle to belong to Canada, to be considered Canadian. Let me start in the 19th century in 1876. The Indian Act was passed, was legislated. And that Indian Act signaled a very sad part of the history of Canada. The residential school were introduced and children were taken away from their home into the residential school. I would like to stop there and invite students after this session, if you are interested, you might want to pursue and find out what it's all about. It took 132 years for an apology to be given by the Canadian government in 2008. Why I point out the span of time is you can see that while we have a dark history, there was resilience and movement to redress. And Canada as a country acknowledges this dark history no matter how long, even after 132 years, and provided an apology. That is the beginning and not the end of the story of reconciliation. In 1885, the Chinese who were born here or who arrived at this shore, a head tax was legislated. It took 121 years for the government of Canada to address and apologize that. In 1914, the ship Kamagatu Maru brought South Asians, Sikhs, Punjabis, Hindus, Muslim South Asians to Canada, anchored at Pier 21, British Columbia, and they were not allowed to enter Canada. After 2 months, they were turned back, and on arrival back in India, they were arrested as rebellions and as revolutionary because India was under the colonial rule of Britain. It took 2016 when Prime Minister Trudeau, after 120 years, to acknowledge this history and apologize for it. In 1941, the Japanese Canadians, because of World War II, were interned, everything they owned were taken away, and they were asked to leave Vancouver City and have to be interned, a polite way of saying they were put in camps, in huts and very unlivable conditions to be segregated. When World War II ended, they were given two choices: go back to Japan, or you have to move east. 1,200 Japanese Canadians who were never born in Japan or know about Japan had to return to Japan. Very similar to Ken's story. They felt they neither belonged in Canada, but at the same time, they also felt as if they were foreign to Japan. It took 1988 for the apology to be made. I just want to stop here, and these are some of the highlights. And I would like to invite students to study these histories because our history helps us to shape the future to be different. So I'm going to stop here and move on to the next slide again. And we're going to tell this story. We hope today by these stories, we engage you into telling the impact of the historical events to three people, and hope to bring a human face to what seems to be historical dates of that history that I just very summarily gave an overview.
Thank you, Gen-Ling. And from what we heard so far, we understand that racism impacts many Canadians for many generations, and this causes trauma. It questions one's self-worth. It questions one's self-identity. It questions one's culture, and it certainly questions one's community. I understand that most of you, if you have taken Canadian history, you might have heard of all the events and the laws that Gen-Ling has mentioned. And I like to put in life the picture of Dr. Henry Wu, who was born in 1965 in British Columbia, Vancouver. In an interview that he was conducted by students at the University of British Columbia, where he is a professor, he recalled the fact that when he was a little boy growing up in Vancouver, his maternal grandfather took him on walks to visit Chinatown frequently. And he was questioning how come his grandfather would go up and down the streets in Chinatown and parade him to his grandfather's friends and colleagues. Later on, when he grew up and became a professor, he looked deep into the history of Chinese Canadians in Vancouver and British Columbia. He recalled that when he was younger, one of the reasons that his grandfather took him on these long walks to show him to the friends of his grandfathers was because his grandfather was not only proud of Henry as a grandson, his grandfather was in bliss and happiness because he had the opportunity to see his grown-up daughter have a child. And before he saw his grown-up daughter, it was decades before he was able to see his daughter. The reason why that was the case was because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. When his grandfather came to Canada in 1923, his grandfather paid the $500 head tax. If you extrapolate the value of $500 in 1923 to today's currency and today's value, it is about it's about $14,000. That is a lot of money for nowadays, and considering the income that people were making at that time. So Henry's grandfather was very proud because he was able to show his friends and his peers that instead of being a lonely old man growing up alone, going to work and living alone, and possibly dying alone, like his friends, he now has a grandson and his daughter and his daughter's family to live with. Imagine many of these peers of Henry's grandfather was working on the railroad, or working in laundromats, or working as storekeepers, or maintaining Chinese restaurants alone, because they were prevented from getting married or prevented from bringing their wives and children over to Canada because the expensive cost of the head tax. Many of these men live in Chinatown, grew old together, and were alone. These bachelor communities were very limited in terms of their exposure to mainstream Canadian culture, mainstream Canadian community. They had restrictions to career paths and opportunities for promotions and seeking ambitions that they may have. They were not considered Canadian citizens, even when they arrived and lived in Canada for many, many generations. So the story of this slide that Dr. Henry Yu is sharing with us is that even though these are men who built the Canadian Railroad and connected Canada from East Coast to West Coast, they were never considered Canadians. They were never given the value and the respect that they deserve as being one of the founding groups of Canadian members. Thank you.
Now we take you on a journey to 1914. I mentioned Kamagatu Maru. And let's go on a journey in the story to the year 2003. Nimrat Randhawa was at that time 8 years old when in 2003, her family were offered permanent residence in Canada. I think the slide disappeared. When they arrived in 2003, that was the Northeast blackout in Toronto and the Pearson Airport. And according to her story, her plane was the last plane to land from India. She was surprised because they arrived in darkness, because prior to coming to Canada, her mother used to tell her that we are going to a country where electricity will never ever be cut out, which was a constant experience they had in India. However, she grew up and it was only at grade 8 when, through the study of the history of Canada with her teacher, she came across the story of the Kamagatu Maru and discovered that the men that were engaged Gurjit Singh to hire a Japanese ship to bring 300 over South Asian seeking a livelihood in Canada was her great-grandfather. Gurjit Singh, in 1914, on May the 22nd, brought the ship to India embarked and landed at Pier 23 with 300 over South Asians who already had some family members in Canada to seek residence in Canada. However, Nimrat Wright, just at your age, he said the importance for me when I learned that my great-grandfather had an even darker reception to Canada than I had. I realized it was important to look back on our history, on our past mistakes. Why? So that we do not repeat them now. So when Pierre Trudeau, you can see in the picture, when Pierre Trudeau apologized in 2016, Nimrat was one of the youngsters where Pierre Trudeau took a photograph to commemorate the apology, and which her great-grandfather was part of the history. So I would like again to say to students, think about these stories we are sharing with you and what it means to be somebody that stand up for discrimination of any sort, like Ya Chen, the two friends, Terry and David, like Sandy, who later encountered other new arrivals that changed his idea of his connection between himself and his community, and like Nimrat, who, although the story of his great-grandfather was a painful story, it turned her into doing something positive towards Canada. I'll pass now the next story shared with you to Sandy.
Thanks, Gen-Ling. So we have a chance to take a look at the chronology of racism in Canada. And we talked a little bit about Japanese internment. Well, here's a story of Japanese internment touching the Japanese community and a baseball team called Asahi. So we talked about Chinatown. Well, in Vancouver, they had a little Japantown. And during the early 20th century, Vancouver was racially segregated. Like, folks weren't allowed to live except for where they were sort of designated. But nothing brought together more of Japanese community than baseball. So downtown East Side neighborhood, where thousands of Japanese immigrants settled as early as 1877, would virtually shut down Japantown, and multiple generations of Japanese Canadians would congregate at Oppenheimer Park near Powell and Main Street. The local businesses would close, schools would be let out early, and if there was a Sunday game, the church would be empty as well too. And they came to watch Vancouver Asahi. They're an amateur group made up entirely of Japanese Canadian. And they won. At first, they used to play within their own community, but then they started to get recognized for their brand of baseball they called brainball, where they played with speed and finesse, trying to outsmart their opponents, who were largely, in that day, they were saying they were bigger white folks who would be power hitters. The Japanese would play a different brand, or the Japanese Canadians would play a different brand of baseball. It took garnered more and more attention to finally they started to play in the City League, and they became successful. Their first City League title came in 1926 and would be followed by several more, including 6 straight between 1936 and 1941. They built themselves up as a gifted winning outfit. But after nearly 30 years of playing baseball, they were forced to disband during the outbreak of war, where Canadian government retroactively interned 22,000 Japanese Canadians to internment camps because they were branded as enemy aliens of the States. Now, it wasn't easy growing up in Japantown, and whatever inroads they had made to cross over racial barriers was destroyed when fingers are pointed at Japanese Canadians, And during the bombing of Pearl Harbor, they were then depossessed of their properties and relocated. At that time, imagine, roughly 75% of Japanese Canadians in Vancouver, 75% were Canadians born in Canada. But it didn't stop William Lyon Mackenzie from declaring all of Canada's Japanese Canadians enemy aliens in the wake of that attack on Pearl Harbor. And Patadachi, one of the eminent Asahi historians, said, most of us were second generation. She authored the book, Asahi, A Legacy of Baseball. And for you sports fans out there and baseball fans, have a look at the legacy of the Asahi. The community, imagine this, had veterans from the First World War that fought for Britain, fought for Canada. Some were at Vimy Ridge, Dunkirk. It didn't matter. These Japanese Canadians were treated as enemy aliens. And in 1942, Mackenzie King invoked the War Measures Act. Curfews were put on Japanese Canadians, property seized, their vehicles, their shipping boats, their houses, their radios and cameras. They were banned from living anywhere within a 100-mile radius of Vancouver. Most of the men were taken to road camps. The families were given 24 hours notice and forced to vacate their homes. And as much as the severity of this was the indignity, was they were placed in holding at first at the exhibition grounds, and where there's testimonial where the exhibition grounds had just been cleared, like here in the CN exhibition, of the animal stalls, that they put beds and housing to hold the Japanese Canadians before they were put away into the interior of BC in internment camps. So many of you may have your own history of forced displacement and perhaps being a refugee yourself, as in Ken very much talked about. But I can't imagine one day playing baseball and being at the height of your league and career, and suddenly the next day you come home, your car is gone, your father's put into a camp, all of your assets are liquidated. You think about your own home. Suddenly, the government comes in and rips everything apart and pushes you in because they think you're an enemy to Canada. So 40 years later, 1988, Brian Mulroney formally apologizes to the Japanese Canadian for the wrongful internment of Japanese at the time. And it's documented. There was not ever one charge of disloyalty by the government towards Japanese Canadians. The only reason why they were interned was they were Japanese. In fact, Japanese Canadians who were interned. So we never really hear all the stories of anti-racism in our history books. And I think this might sound like a story of the past, but we're also going to share you some of the stories of the current. And in terms of a baseball story, folks, I mean, I'm a sports guy. Think about it right now when we talk about what's happening in NBA, World Basketball Association, NHL, in terms of trying to recognize the diversity of sport. Think about all the mascots in the NHL and the NFL that are being reversed because of their racist connotation to Indigenous folks. So we're not that far away from racism in sport back then as it is now. So we're going to show you some video footage of a wonderful series, How You See Me. There's similar series of this, How You See Me as LGBTQ, How You See Me as Muslim. We're just going to show you some testimonial coming from the States of Asian Americans and their experience with racism. Thanks, Ken.
Thanks, Sandy. So as we're watching the video, I'd like to invite our students and our guests to listen very carefully to the sadness, the sorrow, and the hurt that young Asian Americans that are featured in this video talked about, especially looking at and listening in for their loss of identity, their loss of their culture, and their loss of their community. And I'd like you to focus on our young Asian American Filipino woman who talks about losing her identity and not being able to speak Tagalog. So if you bear with me for a moment, I would share the video with you.
There's a really good King of the Hill episode where the neighbors, from Laos, he's Laotian. Hank Hill's like, so are you Chinese or are you Japanese, right? And then the guy's like, no, I'm from Laos. It's a Southeast Asian country. And then in the end, he's like, okay. He's like, so are you Chinese or are you Japanese, right?
Every time I meet somebody new, the question always comes up, where are you from? And I always want to say Minnesota, but you know what they mean.
I was at a bar and someone asked me my name and I said Rachel. And then they said, okay, but what's your real name?
Chinese are not the same as Japanese, are not the same as Koreans, are not the same as Filipinos or Thai or, Indians.
And not every single Asian person gets into college. Not every single Asian person goes to a great school. Not every single person has, a great job.
I can still be Japanese American and know that part of myself and know that history. But it's also okay to still identify as a gangly little suburban kid. And I'm fine with that.
I remember seeing Wayne's World growing up, and I was like, oh, Tia Carrere, she's Filipino, Hawaiian Filipino. And they're like, no, she's playing Cantonese. And I was like, oh, we don't even get to be ourselves. We don't even get to be who we are. We have to play at something else.
Most times in high school or places like this, you don't really have an outlet where you can talk about these Asian American issues. Even in the workplace, you need Asian American mentors who experience the bamboo ceiling, something that happens in corporate America. So most times if you actually look at it, you'll see that a lot of Asian Americans, for instance, they're in middle management or they're in engineering, but you don't really see them in high CEO roles. And the reason being is oftentimes our culture, for instance, my mom always tells me, don't ask for a raise. Keep your head down. When you do your work, your boss will basically, see that you're doing well and he'll give you a raise. But in America, it's not like that. America's the squeakiest wheel gets the oil, right?
People sometimes say that, Nobuko, just forget about Japanese-ness. Just open up yourself more and be more expressive and be more upfront and straightforward.
That goes back to the stereotype of no one talks about Asians because Asians don't speak up.
My parents didn't want me to learn the language. They thought that if I were to learn Tagalog at home, that I would have an accent and I would have the struggles that they had because they were shamed for having thick accents when they first immigrated to the US. I think I struggle with it even now, that talking to my parents, I think they do regret those moments of wanting something different for me. I have two younger sisters who are 10 and 8, and I really feel it's my responsibility to help them come to terms with the identity crisis I know they're going through and bridging the gap between the American culture that they deal with at school and the Asian culture they deal with at home.
There's just so much beauty in the distinction and different cultures out there that I think it would be to everyone's advantage to learn more about all the different places we come from.
I love seeing that these communities are asking for representation because it's so important to me. And I think my ownership is getting to be a part of that.
And even celebrate the fact that it's so cool to be different, to have something to offer that someone else may not, and to exchange ideas rather than just try to be the same idea. I think that concept is just, it frees you so much. There's so much freedom in that.
Thanks again for navigating the technology. It's not an easy thing to do when 1,000 students are watching you, but no pressure. Yeah. So that video is pretty powerful. It's pretty powerful for me to hear as well too. Um, don't you folks already notice how I get excited? Actually, I found myself raising my voice. I think it's like I think really, to be honest, I'm always learning and unlearning about biases and stereotypes and microaggressions that I have held myself towards others, that I'm also unlearning. And I'm also learning about how communities and individuals confront different types of bias. And then it's hurtful. Like, you can hear that in the voices where their names are being erased, where their identities are being minimized to one community. And so we're just sharing with you, some of you may already know, that there are different types of discrimination, if you want to say, that leads to racism. The most basic one is called implicit bias. And those are those really subconscious, sometimes really scary attitudes and behaviors and actions that we have of others. The thing is, we have to also acknowledge that we all have biases, and that's a human element to be able to differentiate one person or one thing from the another. So, for example, humans, you gotta, like, as we're growing up, as kind of like, I guess depends on different theories, when we were growing, you have to know what is a threat to yourself. Well, you have to know what is food. You have to know what's good food or bad food. Unfortunately, we do that with others, and we do that, these implicit biases, we have them towards who we like and who we don't like. I think the notion is thinking about, do I have it, and also seeing if you can reflect on that reality of our implicit bias, because sometimes these biases are coming from stereotypes, and those are characteristics that are made of a whole group, and that's usually terms like those people are like, or don't you act all the same like this. Now, sometimes there could be a little bit of truth to that stereotype, but the thing is with the stereotype is when you overgeneralize. Like poor Hank Hill was trying to explain, like where he's from. It didn't really matter. Someone trying to determine that I'm from Laos, but the person just basically says, oh, it's all the same, right? And then this notion of they all look the same. That's a stereotype. Now, that's a negative stereotype. There's also positive stereotypes, and that's what some Asians face as well, too. People all think that we're good in math. People all think that perhaps we're all studious, and it's true. There are hardworking elements of our community that we should be proud of. I mean, I was good in math, but I was also good in sports, right? And so sometimes even having a positive stereotype, when you think of folks as only being one thing and it's only a model minority, that's also not good, because you're painting the brush and it doesn't leave any differences. And sometimes biases and stereotypes lead to aggressions, and that's those little glances sideways, or sitting beside, moving away, or your body language. And sometimes you see this even in meetings where I work, where you kind of, someone like a woman might put a woman or anyone might just put something on the table, and you see the body language like, oh, right, like they roll their eyes. And these are what's known as microaggressions. And these happen as well on an ongoing basis, right? You gotta catch yourself sometimes when you go into situations. Where is the bias here? And where is the microaggressions? And what happened is, during COVID, it's very evident to us that anti-Asian racism was taking place. And we had a number of groups collect national data to say that this is Eliminate Hate, that in fact Canada has a higher number of anti-Asian racism reports that per capita than the United States. Very much so on BC, but Ontario was equally close. And it was disproportionately targeted at women. The verbal abuse, the harassment, and that occurred widespread, including racial slurs, threats, derogatory remarks. And these incidents are reported as assault, hate, coughing, spitting, physical attacks, and violence. And we might have seen some of the coverage of the news back then that continues now. So what we're going to do now is look at a couple of scenarios that actually speak to different acts of anti-Asian racism to bring it to life on a more realistic level.
So thank you, Sandy, for that. So I'm going to with you scenario 1, and this is an incident that came to my attention as a principal. And even though I wasn't there in the space that this occurred, I wanted to highlight this incident with you because it could happen anywhere. And as teenagers and as high school students, it may happen to you. And one of the points that we are using this scenario to demonstrate the severity of this act of unkindness or act of racism is that unfortunately, if you are the victim, hopefully you will be able to address it with some of the suggestions in this slide. But if you are a bystander or an upstander, we hope that you will be able to support your classmate, your schoolmate, or a friend. So the scenario is that you're walking to class wearing a face mask, and someone walked up to you and pulled off your mask and pretended to cough into your face. So as a teenager and as a young person, what are some of the things that you can do that would be appropriate to defend yourself and to also stand up to the person who pulled off your face mask? So one of the potential responses would be, as a student who is experiencing this as a victim, you may want to say that, excuse me, what did you just do? And, raise your voice, making sure that the perpetrator understood and heard you very loudly and clearly. Another way of responding to this is, again, using your voice. And as you're in school, hopefully others can hear you as well. What you did and how you targeted me are racist acts. Again, name it out, call it out, and tell the other person right in front of you that they're doing this to you. And notice the picture of this scenario. The young woman who's experiencing this, or yourself, young man, is clearly identified as Asian. So the other response that you may want to consider as the person who's experiencing this would be, it's a hurtful act, and it needs to stop. And again, raising your voice, making sure that you exclaim your punctuation so that the other person is aware of this. Always be aware that when you are standing up for yourself or standing up for a friend or a colleague, that you are in a safe space. If you are not in a safe space, if there are potential threats that you feel will impact your security, please walk away and go away until you can find a safe space to report the incident or to share it with a friend or share with an authority member. Another possible situation would be us as individuals who are witnessing the act of racism or violence or harassment. And to support the victim or supporting a friend, you can be a bystander, an upstanding citizen, to say out loud and clearly right there, asking the victim, are you all right? How are you feeling? And how can I help you? And if the victim wants to report this, you should be able to walk the victim to the office if it's in a school setting, or find an authority figure to report this incident. Again, making sure that everybody is safe, you and your friend, your colleague or victim is in a safe space.
Yeah, I just we're going to move to the next one? Okay. I just wanted to go back to the previous one, Ken, just ever so quickly. I guess we're running out of time, but I just want to say too that I love the words and the language that we use. I think if you're really strong and you're able to say it, and it almost sometimes you have to practice these things, but these things don't always just come out of the blue, because you never really know what the heck just went on. Like why did this person step into my space, and then why did they do that? And I think it takes a little bit of presence and understanding of what occurred to speak up. But it's equally important to also, as you said, you may not be able to act right away, but you can take some steps to either look for someone to speak to, like another teacher or a principal, or if you go home, to share it. Because I think sometimes what's happened, I think in my past, is an incident had occurred, I just don't say anything, right? First of all, I don't even know what happened, and then I don't The thing is, you know it's bad is when it feels not right in your stomach and you don't know what's going on, right? But it was wrong. You feel whatever, shame, mad, or anything. But I think at that point, it's really important that you kind of do speak up, find a trusted friend, because I think what happens with a lot of these cases is that we hold on to it for too long, and that it kind of eats you away. You can't let go. And I think that part of support is really important. And the other thing too is, I think, as we say, upstanders, right? I think it's really important if you witness something going on like that. Let's say, for example, this person is way too threatening, and you can't step in to stop it, sort of thing. But as a person who cares, you can go to the person and say, hey, are you okay? I just saw that. That was horrible. Do you need to talk to someone about that? And I think, we underestimate the role of the upstander, the bystander, to really make a difference in that person's life. Because the person can say, no, I'm all right, but you need to check in. It's okay, I'll walk with you. Why don't we have a chance to breathe and reflect on it? And I think it's these kind of reactions and responses that are really important when we see this happening. And we know this happens.
And I'm looking at the time, Sandy.
Oh, okay.
And I'm also looking at a question on the chat that asks, is there an example of racism towards Asians in the media today? So this brings us to the next scenario that we are sharing, which is a Twitter, which I know many of us are very familiar with social media. And this is a tweet put out by what we consider a very reputable media outlet, New York Times. And you find that on your left is the tweet that says New York State reported is the first case of coronavirus in a woman in her late 30s who had traveled to Iran. The announcement brings the total number of cases in the United States to 76. Now that is the news, but if you look at the image, what is that line matched to the image? And the image is what catches a reader attention. I will just point out, implicit in that image, you see Asian people. You see in the background what looks like Chinatown. So we ask the question, if you are looking at this social media, what is the message in this tweet? What is the stereotyping and bias, and why? Why would such a tweet be matched rather with statistics or data or any other image with an image of Asian people with a background of Chinatown? What might be the impact of this tweet? And what is the scale of the impact? I want to bring you to attention that you look at the bottom left corner, 2.1K people responded with emojis. 1.3 thousand shared this tweet. So you can see the influence of media and how news about the coronavirus also began to make racism a viral. Racism against against East Asians and those that look like Asians, including indigenous people. Vancouver police reported that this year, 868% rise in violence and hate incidents were reported. 868% rise. And I want to bring you to attention, as in all social media, there are 710 comments. Imagine what might be the comments. We all have experiences of reading social media and the comments. There will be comments that promote hate and further reinforce hate and further reinforce racism. And there are comments that will counteract what this tweet is suggesting. So I want to pass on Sandy to take it a little bit further and have students think about these images and this kind of news. The news by itself is accurate. There are 78 cases of COVID in United States. And that time the news is talking about imported cases, people going traveling and coming back with the virus. So they just said about a person who traveled to Iran. And it's also interesting. Iran is also in Asia. Why Iran? Because there were many flights coming in to America Among the 78 cases, they were coming from different countries. Sandy or Kian, would you like to make further comments?
Yeah, for me, it points to the importance of your own media literacy, right? Not always taking truth, what is being shown to you, and what is being shown to you, you have to sort of look at it closely, because because of the stereotype of tying Asians to the virus, it would seem like an innocuous kind of image. But why is it that we're showing Chinese folks in this particular image? And I think that for me is questionable, and you have to look beyond that. And of course, as Gen-Ling talked about, the comments can be as hurtful as anything as well too. And I guess given the state of how we use social media, how well do you address these in your own tweets, and how you support or not support your fellow colleagues when they are facing forms of discrimination or harassment because of whatever identity that they face as well too? You also have a role in that tweet to defend and also to step in and intervene as well too. It's not direct, but you definitely have a voice, and or to actually criticize or challenge, in this case, the New York Times in terms of why we suddenly bring this image forward. I don't know. What do you think, Kian, as an educator and such? Your thoughts around bias in media?
Thanks, Sandy and Gen-Ling. So I would like to encourage our young leaders and our young generation to consider these points that Gen-Ling and Sandy have mentioned to you. If you have a younger sibling or friends who are younger than you, who are not here today to hear some of the points that we're making, one of the emphasis that I'd like you to consider is to share some of these thoughts with them. Social media literacy is a very crucial understanding of how we use our devices and the media well. And as leaders of the future, I encourage you to make sure that everything that you read, everything that you retweet, or everything that you see on Instagram or TikTok, you need to reflect on how the content is shared with you and reflect on the source of that information, making sure that what you hear, what you see has legitimacy. So I'm going to share with you some historical details of how social media, before it became popular, was used. And the story here is the last spike.
Ken, before we move on to that, can I put a little bit of extension on this one? On the social media, we all live not only in the physical world, we also live in a virtual world. Basically, humans have evolved where we have two worlds. The virtual world is where social media, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, etc., Facebook. And it's used for social connections, it's used for social interactions. But we are also very aware that in that world, like in the physical world, there is an increasing rise in hate, in racism, in discrimination, in stereotyping. I would like to share with you, it's not on the screen, another tweet that I was alerted to. This is written by the Filipino male nurse who's working in a hospital looking after patients who were infected with COVID. And he tweeted, "A patient just shouted at me and called me, I will not name the expletive, Chinese expletive. Work colleagues were quick to defend me and rally behind me, but man, it was sad. So I went home, stared at the ceiling for 10 minutes, took a shower, and decided to write this tweet." One of the responses, he had 9,000 responses, but among many that were very negative responses was a person wrote to him and said that you must have said something wrong and did something bad to deserve that expletive. And the nurse wrote, "Went out for a quick run to clear my mind and was surprised with all the messages. Thank you. I live alone in a flat when I come back from work, so there's really no one to speak to in person. But all of you out there in the virtual world made my Filipino heart happy and appreciated. although there were some very hurtful ones. Please don't tell my parents back in the Philippines about this, else they will cry again and ask me to come back home. My mother told me to always be kind and understanding, and tonight you all proved that simple act of kindness goes a long way. Why do I share this to you? This young male nurse decided to focus on the positive comments he received and was grateful for it. Secondly, if we have to realize in the virtual world, we hurt people, although we do not know them, we do not see them, but they may be living in circumstances where they do not have a community that we talk about way back in the Exclusion Act. Young, bachelor, Chinese living beside the railroad, carving out a living, building the railroad for Canada. In 2021, we have young people working in our front line, living alone, and their family, and this man's family is back in Philippines. And he's also aware that it went viral, that it could be picked up in Philippines, and his parents will hear about him. And he was worried about their well-being. So I just want to point out the endemic harm racism can have to people that we may not even have met. And it's like throwing a pebble in the water where whether the ripples are positive or the ripples cause a lot of damage. So one of the questions that was posed was an excellent question, an example of racism today and how we can recognize it and address it. Some of the examples given in the first scenario is in the physical world, but in the virtual world, all of us, young and old, young people, youth, all of you can intervene and disrupt hate and racism and discrimination. Now I want to pass it back to Kian as he shares another historical and tie it back to the history of how we encounter and address racism.
Thank you, Gen-Ling, for that very meaningful and deep story. So in the next slide that we're looking at here, if you look at the picture that is displayed here, this is the last spike, and it's a very popular image that we see in our history books, in the media. We see a group of men, all men and all white, making sure that they are in this photo, demonstrating that the last spike was struck on the Canadian Pacific Railroad in 1887 in November in British Columbia. When I saw this image as a young boy in school, I thought, okay, this is great. It's a great way to celebrate the completion of the Canadian Railroad in 1885. Little did I know then that of all the railroad workers in the West, 72% of those laborers were of Chinese background. So if you look at this picture here, you would not be able to say, oh, the Chinese Canadians contributed to the building of our nation. However, in reality, it's these people, 72% of the laborers that contributed to building the western part of our railroad, that connected Canada together, that allowed Europeans to settle into the western provinces. They were never given the credit. So when you look at this in textbooks and you look at the media injustice that was done, whether this was intentional or not, I can't speak to that, but we need to make sure that social media literacy is combined with real world media, real world textbooks, and real world content. So therefore, it is really crucial for us to recognize that the images that we see may not be the real fact of life. And this demonstrates the fact of disinformation and fake news that was published in our textbooks.
And I think one of the questions we asked, but just can't short, is who is telling the story? And currently, we still have the efficacy and the ability to enrich that story The story of the last fight now is further enriched with the story of the picture shown of the Chinese workers on the railway. And that is the hope, and that is the change that we see Canada. Canada is a country that can acknowledge its past mistakes, apologize for it, and begin to build a story that's more multifaceted that represent people. So we want to turn to the last slide as a summary slide of showing how identity, our community, and our culture come together. Instead of saying, how do you see me? We ask the question, how do I see me? How do I see us? Because how do you see me are people's and social construction of who we are. We have to join in the storytelling, in the intervention, in the work by saying, how do I see me? How do I see us? Not just my community, but all communities. And I'm noticing the time we have, we do not have much time, and I'll pass it to Ken and Sandy to make a few remarks, and we'll end with a poem that I'd like to share.
Yeah, so how do I see me? How do I see us? Well, I think my story is one that I see myself differently as I have grown up. And that identity was shaped first by outside factors. And that is how the community saw the Chinese folks, how I saw myself. And it was only until I unearthed some of the, it's crazy, right? It's only until I unearthed all of the discrimination, racism that the community confronted that I began to understand that it's not as rosy as I would think. And how I began to do it, I think for me is a little bit unfortunate, is it was all self-journey. It was all the research and the writing and the stories that I had to unearth in my own histories and culture that wasn't shown at all in the school system for me to become the person, so to speak, who I am. So seeing my community now is so much different than how I felt before. My son is half Chinese and half Scottish, and I embrace that part of me, but it definitely wasn't an easy journey when I was denying my own. And I think for me, I ask all of the students to think about your own journey, learn your own story, ask your own family histories, and get to know where you came from. And then as well, where do other folks come? Ask their story, because I think if we can all share our stories in a good and honest way and listen, we can be far stronger as a community.
Thank you, Sandy. And I noticed that we need to give some time to Morgan, the student, to speak, and we are at 2:20. Ken, if you do not mind, I will just go ahead.
Please go ahead.
The poem, The Words, by Tom Fullery. I'm sorry, no comment. That's not my call. Have you ever said that? Thought that? Oh. Maybe you too feel horrified and just trying to find a way to articulate the emotions, but you do not know what to say. I'm sorry, I can't tell you. Some responses can't be shown, but if you truly want to express your feelings, then your words must be your own. I know silence is complicity, but many do not know what to say or do. Well, here's our humble opinion, and we won't be perfect, but it's time. Respond, because we are human, whether your skin is brown or black or white. Respond, because respond we must, when our conscience knows what's right. How would you respond if your brother or sister had to live in fear or threat? How would you respond if your son or daughter had a knee upon their neck? Respond in any way that's true to you, because that's what we need to hear. Articulate your pain, your shame, your sadness, guilt, or fear. If you feel ignorant and try to educate yourself, read books, have conversations, learn about the history and the scars of colonization. Thank you to Loyola, and thank you to students. Over to Morgan, and we hope
We would like to sincerely thank Gen-Ling Chang, Ken Liu, and Sandy Yap for joining us today and sharing their experiences, knowledge, passion, and commitment to social justice. Everyone will be sent a short survey after the presentation to provide feedback on the series and suggestions for next steps to support our community. Join us next on March 3rd, 2021, when we welcome Francis Atta to speak about overcoming systemic barriers.
Thank you very much, everyone.